He starts the day before the city wakes up, when the streets are still covered in fog and the silence seems to have weight. While many rush through breakfast to face yet another office routine, he puts on his work clothes with the awareness that, on that day, another family will cry. And he will be there, not as the protagonist, but as someone who helps close the final chapter of someone's story. There's no glamour in what he does. There's no manual either. Only the consistency of a craft that needs to be done with precision, respect, and above all, humanity. Because it's not just about digging a hole. It's about understanding that in that space lie memories, regrets, promises left unfulfilled, and loves that never said goodbye properly. While his hands are stained with soil, his mind travels through 1,000 thoughts. Each name etched on a tombstone carries a universe he will never know. And even so, he feels as if each of those stories leaves a bit of itself with him. Because those who live with death daily learn to value every gesture of life. People look at him with a certain unease. Some avoid contact. Others make nervous jokes, as if humor were a way to keep fear at bay. He understands. Death is frightening, but to him, death also teaches. It teaches about time, about presence, about how much we postpone saying what should be said now. Once, a child asked him if he wasn't afraid of ghosts. He smiled and replied that the living are scarier. Because it's the living who judge, who ignore, who hurt with words and glances. The dead, they just rest. And sometimes, they seem more at peace than many who rush along the sidewalks. There are days when he comes home with shoulders heavier than the shovel he carries. It's not his body that hurts. It's his soul. It hurts when he sees a mother clinging to her son's coffin. It hurts when he realizes that no one showed up for an old man's burial. It hurts because, even without knowing the dead, he feels the pain of those left behind. The cemetery is not a place of endings for him. It is a field full of stories that didn't end as planned. Loves that remained incomplete, dreams cut short, and lives that may have been more intense than they seemed from the outside. He has learned to read between the lines of silence. Sometimes, when the sun is setting, he stops for a minute among the graves and looks at the sky, not out of mysticism, but because that moment, for him, is a reminder that time doesn't stop, that everything passes, and that one day, even he will be remembered by a simple tombstone with a start date and an end date, and everything else summarized by a dash. He never liked crowds, nor talking too much. But there, in the cemetery, he found a kind of belonging. A place where he didn't need to explain himself. Where silence was understood. Where presence was enough. And where he could be whole, even when the outside world demanded masks and performances. Some people think his profession is dark, but he knows that darkness lies in living without purpose. In spending life chasing things that won't fit inside a coffin. He, at least, learned early the value of now. And maybe that's why he lives with more depth than many who work in tall buildings. One day, he found a note inside the pocket of a jacket he was preparing for burial. It read, "Sorry I didn't say I loved you." He held the paper gently, as if holding an open wound. And he thought about how many choked up words go down with the earth. How many lives are lost for lack of courage to love. He doesn't always manage to keep his composure. Sometimes his eyes get heavy, sometimes his throat tightens. But he has learned to cry in silence. Because in his job, there's no room for breakdowns. He needs to be steady. He needs to be whole. Even when something inside him begs to stop, deep down, he knows he's a guardian. Someone who holds things together while the world collapses for those who've lost someone. He helps make the end less cruel. Turns goodbyes into rituals of respect. Ensures that, at least there, in the final resting place, there is dignity. He's seen it all. Children buried with toys. Young people taken too soon. Couples buried side by side after a lifetime together. Each image, each ceremony, leaves a mark he doesn't forget. He just learns to live with it as part of his own path. He doesn't tell his story with pride or shame. He tells it with the simplicity of someone who understands that the value of life lies in what we build between the first and last breath. And that in the end we take nothing, but we leave everything in the hearts of those who truly loved us. Many ask how he does it, how he doesn't go mad, how he doesn't give in to sadness. And he responds with something simple: I hold on to life. Because those who live with death learn to love the smell of coffee, the sound of rain, the laughter of loved ones. Learn that what really matters are the details. At home, he's different. Quiet, but affectionate. He values slow conversations, long hugs, unhurried Sundays. Because he knows time is the most precious thing there is. And because he lives each day remembering that there are no guarantees, only choices. He has no religion, but he has faith. Faith that the good done here remains. Faith that intentions weigh more than words. Faith that even when no one is watching, it's possible to plant dignity. When he walks the streets outside of work, he sometimes forgets that the world spins at another pace. People walk hurriedly, distracted, eyes on screens and ears closed. He who hears the silence of cemeteries finds the noise of hurry strange. And he understands that there is more death in the living who feel nothing than in the dead who rest. Some mornings, arriving at work, he finds fresh flowers on old graves. And that moves him, because it reminds him that memory is a form of eternity. And that sometimes, even without presence, there can still be meaning. There was a funeral where no one showed up, just him, the coffin, and the silence. It was one of the most painful scenes in his journey, because no one should leave alone, so he stayed there longer, said words no one would hear, because he believed every human being deserves an end with some reverence. He doesn't like endings, but he has learned to respect them, because endings are also doors, and because, as painful as it is, closing something is also recognizing that it existed. And that, in itself, is already a miracle. He's thought of changing professions. He's feared getting sick. He's felt invisible. But deep down, he knew what he did was necessary. And that someone had to do it. So he kept going, one day at a time, one burial at a time, one silence at a time. He doesn't know how many graves he's dug, but he knows how many lives have changed after a burial. Because death, as cruel as it may seem, has the power to reveal what is essential. And he, even quietly, takes part in that every day. When people ask what he does for a living, he replies calmly, I help people say goodbye. And that says more about him than any diploma. Because in the end, he's not just a gravedigger. He's someone who reminds the world that everything is fleeting, and that, precisely because of that, it must be lived with the heart. That cloudy morning, he arrived at the cemetery with his boots still wet from the rain the night before. The soil was heavier, harder to move, but he was no longer surprised by the ground's resistance. He knew that, many times the earth refused to make room for one more interrupted story. And still he dug. Because that was his mission, to make space for silence. The supervisor had left a note with the name of the deceased, the time and the location. It was a 53-year-old man, victim of a heart attack. No family member had confirmed attendance. That always hurt a bit more. Because he knew what wounds the most isn't the departure, it's the forgetting. And when he read that name, which meant little to the world, he felt it had to mean something to someone. Even if it was just in that final act. While he dug, a group of students passed outside the cemetery fence, laughing loudly, taking pictures, as if the landscape of tombstones was nothing more than a gloomy backdrop for social media. He didn't mind, but he felt that silent discomfort only those who live with grief understand. The pain of seeing that many still haven't learned to respect the end. His pocket radio played an old song, One of those nobody listens to anymore. He let it play. The melody filled the air, as if it wanted to comfort not only his soul, but also every piece of land that would now receive another finished life. The music in that moment was more respectful than many of the speeches he had heard at funerals. When he paused to drink water, he looked around. The row of tombs seemed to tell the story of an entire country. Dates, names, phrases engraved with affection, or just the bare essentials. Some had fresh flowers, others rust, dry leaves, and abandonment. It was impossible not to wonder, who would you become if no one remembered your name anymore? The coffin arrived around noon. There was no procession, no sound car, just the funeral. Driver and a man in a wrinkled suit, who looked more like a distant acquaintance than someone of blood. The gravedigger nodded. That was enough. No words were needed. That was intimacy enough between those who understand pain in silence. As they lowered the coffin, a colder breeze blew between the trees. He always noticed those subtle changes in the weather, as if the world itself wanted to participate in the farewell, and at that moment, something inside him tightened. Not for the stranger who was leaving, but for all the untold stories that left with him. What songs had he loved? What fears had he never revealed? What was left unsaid? While covering the grave, one of the man's shoes got soaked with mud. The gravedigger offered a cloth, but the other declined. He said, "It no longer matters." That stuck in his mind for the rest of the day. Because when even your feet accept the dirt, perhaps your heart has already gotten used to the weight of goodbye. After the burial, he walked to a concrete bench and sat for a moment. There, where no one demanded productivity, where there were no goals or deadlines, he could just be someone trying to understand life through death. And in that interval between burials, he rediscovered pieces of himself. In the staff room, he hung up his coat, washed his face, and stared at the old mirror above the sink. Sometimes, the reflection surprised him. Not because of age, but because of expression. It was a face that had learned to hide pain so as not to scare others. A face that carried too many stories, even while being merely a supporting character. In all of them, a colleague asked if he would be available for the next Saturday, 2 more burials scheduled. He nodded as always, because his schedule wasn't made of parties, but of endings. And because deep down, he knew each burial was also an opportunity to ensure someone would be remembered with dignity, even if no one else was there for that. When he left the cemetery that day, the sun had finally broken through the clouds. And he thought about how light can feel aggressive after so many hours in the shadows. The city carried on, alive, rushed, noisy. But he walked slowly, as if each step were an unspoken prayer. On the main street, a flower shop displayed colorful vases. He bought a small bouquet of chrysanthemums, even without having a specific destination for them. He just felt that someone deserved those flowers. Maybe himself. Maybe the man from the lonely burial. Maybe anyone who passed by that gesture and understood that memory is a form of affection. On the bus, he stood holding one of the metal bars, observing the people around him. Some were laughing, others arguing on the phone. No one noticed him. And that didn't bother him. He had gotten used to invisibility. In fact, in many moments, it was his best companion. When he got home, he placed the bouquet in a glass of water on the kitchen table. That small improvised altar was a way of saying that even ordinary days can have meaning. Because to him, every life is sacred, even the one no one celebrates. During dinner, he listened to a news report commenting on mortality statistics, cold numbers, graphs, comparisons. He turned it off. Because he knew that each number represented a face, a name, a story, and no one should be reduced to a percentage. Before going to sleep, he leafed through an old notebook where he sometimes wrote loose phrases. He found a note from months earlier. "I work with endings, but I keep searching for new beginnings." He smiled at the simplicity of the sentence, That was exactly it. Each grave he dug was also a reminder to live more truthfully. Rain began to fall lightly again during the night. He heard it hitting the window like someone listening to an old conversation. And he wondered, how many people don't see rain as a blessing? To him, each drop was a reminder that everything deep comes slowly, just like pain. Just like love. In the early morning, he dreamed of a different cemetery. In it, the tombstones had not only names but also unfulfilled wishes, unsent letters, swallowed words. And in the dream, he walked among those graves, reading each story and leaving flowers on all of them. He woke up with a heavy yet lighter heart. While putting on his work clothes the next day, he remembered the man with no funeral. And he decided something. At the next lonely burial, he would bring a flower, not out of duty, but because no one should leave without a gesture of love, even from a stranger. During the mid-morning break, he mentioned the idea to a colleague. The other just shrugged. But he noticed, in the friend's eyes, a silent respect. Because kindness, in that place of sorrow, was an act of resistance. Do you also feel that sometimes small gestures speak louder than grand speeches? At the end of the afternoon, he helped close the main gate. And before leaving, he walked alone among the graves for a few minutes. It wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. Gratitude for understanding that, while others passed by like tourists of grief, he remained as a guardian of forgotten stories. He knew that job would never earn him any tributes, but he didn't work for recognition. He worked because someone had to ensure that, even in the end, dignity was preserved. And that was enough. That morning, the gravedigger arrived before sunrise. The fog covered the entire cemetery, as if the world hadn't yet awakened to another day of farewells. He liked that hour, when silence was absolute and the ground had yet to be stepped on. It was as if death were still sleeping, and he had a moment alone with everything no one wanted to see. The first task was to inspect the new area, where more graves were being prepared. The city was growing, and with it, the number of dead increased. As well, it was a silent, somber, and inevitable growth. As he walked among the stakes and markings, he wondered, how long would there be space? And what would happen when even death ran out of room? He received a notice from the office. Today, there are 3 burials. One of them will have military honors. He never liked pompous funerals. Not out of disdain, but because, often, theatrical gestures masked how much that person had been ignored in life. It was a harsh contrast. Expensive. Flowers on graves of absent affections. The first burial of the day was a 22-year-old young woman. She had suffered a motorcycle accident. Her family arrived devastated, holding crumpled photos and letters. The father didn't speak. The mother sobbed with her head resting on the casket. The gravedigger kept his posture, but something inside him trembled. It was impossible not to be affected. The pain of others always left a crack. While covering the grave with soil, one of the deceased's friends tossed a letter in with the flowers. The paper remained partially visible. He read it unintentionally. Sorry for not saying everything you deserved to hear. And that haunted him for the rest of the day. How many incomplete goodbyes had he witnessed? How many words left unsaid? Turned to dust? During his lunch break, he sat behind the chapel. He ate in silence, hands still dirty with soil. He didn't mind. Dirt, in that context, was a sign of respect. Because every grave carefully dug was a tribute the world didn't always see. The second burial was an 87-year-old man. A former soldier with a flag draped over the coffin, gun salutes, and speeches. The gravedigger listened in silence. But it was only when the granddaughter stepped forward and said, through tears, "He was my hero even when no one noticed," that he felt something truly genuine had been spoken. The rest was protocol, but that was love. Before covering the second grave, he noticed an elderly woman kneeling beside another tomb, far from the ceremony. She cried quietly, like someone who had learned not to disturb others with her grief. He recognized her. She was there every week. He had never spoken to her. But that day, he wished he had the courage to ask, "Would you like some company?" The last ceremony was for an 8-year-old child. Aggressive cancer, they said. The coffin seemed far too small. The silence of those present was broken only by sobs, and at that moment, the gravedigger wished his job didn't exist. That no one had to bury a childhood. After the burial, the child's parents thanked him, their eyes red. They thanked him for the gentleness, the care, the respectful way everything had been conducted. He simply nodded. But that gesture would sustain him for weeks. Because being seen in that kind of pain was rare. At the end of the day, back in the locker room, he removed his gloves, looked at his calloused hands and thought, how many stories have these hands buried? And more than that, how many more would they still bury? It was a question without an answer, but one that always returned. Because every gravedigger carries more than tools. They carry memories that aren't theirs, but refuse to go away. At home, he turned the radio to a random station. He needed something light, but a song began to play, slow, deep. The lyrics spoke of time passing without asking permission. He sat on the couch and listened, still. Sometimes it was good to do nothing, just feel. Later, he turned on the television. A program was talking about invisible professions. Gravediggers weren't mentioned, and he laughed to himself. Invisibility was already part of the uniform. But deep down, he wished that just once, someone would say, they deserve to be remembered too. That night, before bed, he wrote in his notebook, burying bodies is easy. What's hard is burying memories. And he stared at that sentence for a long time, because he knew how true it was. Some memories insist on surviving, even under meters of earth. While sleeping, he had a nightmare. He dreamed he was digging a grave and found a photograph. It was of him as a child. He woke up with his heart racing. He wondered, by taking such care of death, had he forgotten to care for his own life? The next morning, while having coffee, he decided to call his brother, whom he hadn't spoken to in months. It was a simple conversation, but it served as a reminder. Life is too short to let silences stretch unnecessarily. And no one understands that better than someone who deals with endings every day. Are you also postponing conversations that should happen now? On the way to work, he passed in front of a school. Children were laughing in the yard, jumping rope, running between benches. He stopped for a moment, just to watch. And he wondered what his life would have been like if he had chosen a different path. But there was no bitterness. Just a soft melancholy, like someone who knows certain choices are final. Back at the cemetery, he found a note at the front gate. Someone had left a thank you letter for the burial held the week before. The handwriting was shaky but full of gratitude. He placed the paper in his pocket without saying a word. That was worth more than any medal. Throughout the day, he dug 2 new graves. The heat was intense, his body ached. But he didn't complain. Because somehow, he had learned to turn physical effort into a spiritual gesture. Each shovel of dirt was a reverence. Each grave, a silent altar. In the afternoon break, he helped an elderly man find his wife's grave. They walked together among old headstones. When they found it, the old man knelt down, pulled a rose wrapped in paper from his pocket, and began talking to her, as if she were still alive. The gravedigger stepped away in silence. Some scenes should never be interrupted. As he waited for his shift to end, he watched a large tree in the center of the grounds. Its branches seemed to touch the sky. And he thought, how many invisible roots hold this up? It was the same with him. Invisible on the outside, but rooted in everything the world insists on ignoring. Do you also feel that, even in silence, you carry more than others imagine? On his way out, he passed once more by the woman who cried alone. This time, he dared a good afternoon. She replied with a weak but sincere smile. Sometimes, a simple phrase is all the soul needs to keep going. On the way home, he bought 2 candles. One to light for those who left without goodbyes. Another for himself, as a reminder that he was still alive, even surrounded by death. And as he walked down the sidewalk, he felt the world kept moving, but he carried each name inside him as if they were part of his own story. The next morning, the gravedigger woke up to the sound of heavy rain. Through the window, the cemetery looked even more silent. The soaked earth announced it would be a difficult day. Burying someone in the rain was more than a physical effort. It was an emotional one. As if the whole world were mourning. He arrived early, and even under the downpour, began preparing a new grave. As he dug, he felt the mud sticking to his boots, the wind cutting his face, and his heart growing heavy. It wasn't just the weather, it was the symbolism. There was something deeply symbolic about burying someone when the sky cried in. The morning, he helped a family bury a grandmother. They arrived hunched under umbrellas, eyes downcast and voices muffled. There were no speeches, no songs, only tears and whispered goodbyes. Sometimes speaks louder than any rite. A child pointed to the grave and asked his father, "Will she be alone here?" The question echoed in the gravedigger's mind for the rest of the day. Because even if he didn't want to, he also wondered that in silence. Do the dead feel lonely? After the burial, he gathered the shovels, covered the grave, and stood looking at it longer than necessary. He felt he needed to, as if a piece of him had also been buried there. He couldn't explain why. He just knew that this profession required more than strong arms. It required soul. During his break, he entered the chapel. He sat on the last bench and closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't ask for anything. He just stayed. Sometimes, the silence of a cold bench could offer more comfort than any word. He didn't want miracles. He just wanted to keep enduring. Later, he passed through the old section of the cemetery. Worn-out headstones, faded names, tilted crosses. And he thought, one day, no one will remember these faces, or these stories. And then, he felt an urgency inside, the desire to keep remembering. Because forgetting is dying again. While walking, he stopped in front of a grave with a poem engraved on it. It was short, but deep. If I had known it would be the last time, I would have stayed longer. He swallowed hard. Because there was so much truth in that phrase. And he knew it better than anyone. A young man approached later, looking for a friend's grave. He was nervous, eyes red. The gravedigger helped him. They walked together to the spot. The boy thanked him, knelt down, and stayed there, murmuring something through tears. As he left, he shook the gravedigger's hand and said, "You do a job no one wants to see, but that everyone needs." He held that in his heart. At the end of his shift, he found a flower left on the wall, alone, no note, no context. He picked it up and placed it in a vase near the entrance. It was a simple gesture, but to him, it was like giving something back to the world, even if he didn't know who it belonged to. Have you ever returned something to the world without expecting recognition? At home, he took off his soaked clothes and took a hot shower. He stood under the water for minutes. It felt like he was washing not just his body, but his soul. Because the pain of others, over time, seeps into your skin. And he knew he needed to cleanse himself on the inside. At dinner, he didn't turn on the TV. He preferred silence. The food was simple. But at that moment, he felt a strange gratitude for being alive. For being able to chew, swallow, breathe. Things that for others had already ended. That night, he lay down earlier. But sleep didn't come. He picked up his notebook and wrote, "I work with death, but all I want is to preserve life." He closed the notebook and smiled slightly, because that phrase said it all. And he felt there was still much to be done. The next day, upon arriving at the cemetery, he found a group of students with a teacher. They were there for a history activity. One of them approached and asked, "Aren't you afraid?" He thought for a second and replied, "Not of death, but of what people stop living because they fear it." At lunch, he got a call from an old friend. They hadn't spoken in years. The conversation was brief, but left a good feeling. It was rare to feel remembered outside that dark universe. And that renewed something inside him. Returning to work, he helped prepare a burial for a woman with no family. No one came. No friends. No flowers. Just a name on a piece of paper. And in that moment he understood, absence is also a presence. A screaming absence. As he covered that lonely grave, he thought about his own death. Who would come? Who would remember? And then, he felt that he didn't want to be remembered with tears, but with respect. Not as a hero, but as someone who did what needed to be done with dignity. During a final inspection, he saw that one of the old graves had a broken headstone. He grabbed tools, and even though it wasn't required, he fixed it. He didn't know who was buried there, but he believed. Respect doesn't depend on remembrance. It depends on values. Do you believe some silent actions also carry eternal weight? On his way out, he crossed paths with an elderly woman carrying flowers. She stopped him and said, "I don't know your name, but I pray for you every day." He was speechless. He just nodded, moved. Sometimes, the faith of others is what sustains us when ours is weak. At home, later, he lit a candle for everyone he had ever buried. He sat watching the flame, imagining the faces, the cries, the silences. It was his way of paying tribute. Even if the world didn't see. Before bed, he thought about writing a book. Not with names or dates, but with sensations. With everything that never fit into spoken words. Because he knew that carrying those stories alone was, little by little, a way of dying in life. Do you also feel there are stories inside you that have never been told? He finally lay down and felt his body heavy. But inside, an unusual lightness. As if each grave he dug had also helped open space within him for something greater. Something he didn't even know how to name. Maybe it was peace. In the following days he continued with his quiet routine. The shovels, the graves, the rituals. Nothing changed on the outside, but something in him seemed to have matured in silence, as if each goodbye made him more attentive to how he lived. The encounters, the rain gave way to clear skies, and with the dry weather came more ceremonies, more tight embraces around the graves, more eyes searching for comfort in the soil. And he was there, always present, steady, even when everything inside him trembled. He began to look more tenderly at each family. He noticed the details, the favorite flower placed on the coffin, the folded letter left at the deceased's chest, the lost gaze of those who remained. He began to understand that every grief is an interrupted story. Once, a white-haired woman asked him to read a Bible passage during her husband's burial. The gravedigger's voice trembled as he spoke the words, but she held his hand and said, "You speak with truth. That's what matters." And he never forgot that. At another moment, he was visited by a boy who had buried his father years earlier. He came just to say thank you. He said that remembering the gravedigger's silent presence that day helped him not feel alone. And that touched him deeply, because sometimes what seems small to the one who gives is enormous to the one who receives. That same day, while burying a woman who had lived almost a century, he paused in front of the grave and thought, if I reach that age, what will I remember? And he felt that, even amid death, there was still time to build living memories. On his way home, he passed a group of children playing in the street. One of them waved and said, "Hi, mister." He smiled, and for the first time in a long time, he felt visible outside the cemetery walls. Sometimes it's in the little things that life shouts the loudest. On a Sunday off, he decided to visit his own parents' grave. He carefully cleared the dry leaves, changed the flowers, and sat beside them for a few minutes. He spoke little, but there, among the memories, he felt a reconnection with his roots. As if for a moment, he was the one who needed to be comforted. On the way back, he stopped at the bakery and bought a sweet bun. He sat on a park bench, ate slowly, and watched people move around. It was a simple gesture, but in that simplicity, there was a feeling of fulfillment he hadn't felt in a long time. Have you ever felt peace in ordinary moments, as if life was hugging you without saying a word? He began writing letters to himself. Not to be read, but to be written. It was his way of listening to himself, of processing what he lived every day in silence. And with each new letter, he felt something inside him reorganized. In one of those letters, he wrote, "Death has taught me more about life than any other teacher." And when he finished the sentence, he knew it wasn't just beautiful, it was deeply true. He knew his profession would never be celebrated. There would be no awards, no applause, no headlines. But he also knew his presence was necessary, that his silence was useful, that his empathy was invisible, but essential. During a special event at the cemetery, he was invited to say a few words. He hesitated but accepted. He stepped onto the small improvised stage and said, "I don't take care of death. I take care of the last embrace between those who leave and those who stay." And there was silence. And then, applause that night. He couldn't sleep. But for the first time, the insomnia didn't hurt. It simply kept him company, like an old friend who sits beside you without saying anything. And he understood, not all pain needs to be fought. Some just need to be welcomed. In the following weeks, more burials, more stories, more families. But instead of weight, he began to feel honor. Because being present at the time of someone else's pain is one of the purest forms of love. He started taking care of a small garden next to his house. He planted flowers he'd seen in the hands of grieving families, daisies, lily, white roses. He said it was his way of replanting life, even after dealing with so many endings. Do you also nurture something that reconnects you with the world? 1. Overcast afternoon. A teenage girl came to the cemetery to visit her brother. She sat beside the grave for over an hour. On her way out, she passed by him and said, "Thank you for keeping this place so beautiful. Here is where I feel like he still hears me." He simply nodded. But inside, he cried. He noticed some people came just to walk among the graves. And that made him happy. Because that place, which for many symbolized an end, could also be a space of reflection, of memory, of reconciliation with the past. At night, he began sorting personal items for donation. Books, clothes, tools. He wanted to leave less weight behind, not because he felt the end was near, but because he understood that life gets lighter when we learn to let go. He started jotting down phrases he heard from families. Some funny, others moving. One day, he plans to turn them into a book. Because he believes the deepest wisdom doesn't come from philosophers. It comes from those who suffer and survive. In a moment of exhaustion, he thought about quitting, about changing his life. But when he remembered the looks, the handshakes, the silent farewells, he knew he couldn't. Because that was his calling, not out of duty, but out of meaning. Have you discovered your place in the world, even when no one else understands it? In the last week, he buried a man who had lived alone, no visitors, no relatives. But as he covered the grave, he placed a flower and whispered, "You weren't overlooked." Because deep down, that's what everyone wants to be seen. He made friends with a woman who came every Sunday to visit her husband. She started bringing coffee and sharing it with him on her way out. They talked about everything. And that became one of his favorite moments of the week. One night, he woke from a strange dream. He was walking among empty graves but heard voices thanking him. He saw no faces, but he woke up at peace. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was something more. The next morning, he wrote on the wall of the tool shed, "Life goes on, even here." And he understood that, even surrounded by death, he was still a sower of life, not with flowers, not with words, but with presence. If you've made it this far, maybe you've understood. Life doesn't need grand stages to be meaningful. Sometimes all it needs is someone who looks at the world's hidden sorrows and chooses to stay. If this story touched you, show that you're here too. Write in the comments, "I choose to stay too." Let's show the world that, even in silence, we still feel.